Hello, welcome back to our beginners animation course. We have our bouncing ball doing pretty well here. If we hit play, we can see it's bouncing pretty convincingly. Bounces across the room. But we're not quite done yet. We're going to add a bit of a dynamic effect to the ball's bouncing. We're going to have it, when it hits the floor, it'll kind of do a little bit of a squashing motion, like the ball compresses. And then as it bounces off the floor, it kind of stretches out a little bit. Then it'll snap back to its original shape. Every time it hits the ground, it'll have a little bit of a squash to it and stretch to it as it gets into the air, rebounding off the floor. So the way we'll do that is we'll use a deformer. Deformers can be found in several of these modules, such as modeling. You'll see there's a deform menu in the modeling module, as well as in the rigging module. They're the same menus, so it doesn't really matter where you go to find the deformer we're going to be using. But we'll just go to the modeling module under deform, and we have here Nonlinear Squash. So I have the ball selected, so when I apply the squash, it will apply to the ball that we have selected. So with Nonlinear Squash here, and I go into the options, and this is our create squash deformer options. I'm just going to go to edit, reset settings, just to make sure we're using our default settings, and hit create. So I'm going to press spacebar in my perspective, or I should say side view here, and then press F to frame the ball. I'm going to zoom in on it so we can see how it looks. Hold down the spacebar for my hotbox. Let's go ahead and go back to the perspective view and press F again, so now we can rotate around our ball and see what's going on. So you can see I have the squash handle selected. It's applied to the sphere. If I hit 4 for wireframe, you'll see that as I have my squash handle selected, the sphere is this pink color, indicating that it is being affected by the squash deformer that I have selected. Over here in the inputs under the channel box, I can click this squash one here, and we have some options open up. Several things with factor, expand, max position, smoothness, and so on. We're not doing anything too complicated, so we're not going to be going into a whole lot of these different options that we could use, but we're going to mess with them a little bit to get the effect we're looking for. If you select the factor channel, minimize, click, and drag back and forth, you can see how it affects the ball. If you drag to the left, it squashes it. If you drag to the right, it stretches it out. And we're not going to do anything too crazy. But one thing we need to make sure of is that when we hit the floor, if you notice the bottom of the ball here, when I squash it, the bottom of the ball rises upwards. Because of that, when I do apply the squash to the ball, it'll be floating above the floor because of the bottom surface of the ball rising up like this. So to fix this, we're going to need to adjust the low bound and the high bound. Let's first grab the low bound. If we increase this value to 0, because it starts off at -1, the lower section of the squash deformer is moving upwards until it gets to about the halfway point of the ball, in which point it's kind of capping off the effect of the squash like so. Now let's actually press W to activate our move tool and move the squash deformer down so that this point where our gizmo is situated, is at the base of the sphere. One easy way to do that, if I zoom in here and see the pole of the ball here, hold on the V key, it's snap to point. I just snap my squash deformer to the pole of the ball. So now we have this effect, and now I have the factor of the squash manipulated some. By default it's at 0, of course, when it has no effect. But by increasing it a little bit or decreasing it, we can see the result of the squash right away as we make these adjustments. So I've changed the low bound to 0, and I've moved the squash down to the base of the sphere. So now I'm going to increase the high bound until it covers the entire sphere. So this little crosshair at the top of the squash deformer needs to be above the sphere, or at least high enough that it encloses the sphere. So now when I select the factor channel, minimize, click, and drag back and forth, you can see now we get this stretch and squash effect where it comes from the base of the sphere. It's no longer changing the position of the bottom of the sphere. So when the sphere hits the ground, and then we decide to squash it like this, not quite like this, but you know what I mean. it will not move the position of the base of the sphere, so it won't look like it's floating. And that's the main thing we're looking at. Let's change the factor back to 0, because right now the ball's floating up in the middle of the air. And let's go back to our side view. So now I can hit play. So one thing right off the bat, you'll see that our squash deformer is still way over here. Even though it's applied to the ball is moving, and the squash deformer is not. So we need to fix that. Let's go back to the beginning of the animation, make a frame 1, and we need to parent the squash deformer to the ball so that it moves with the ball. So with the squash deformer selected, hold shift and select the ball second, and then press the P key. By pressing P, you parent the first object you selected to the second object. So now let's go back to our side view. So now when we hit play, if we zoom in on the sphere, we'll see that the squash deformer is now still with the sphere. So let's select the squash deformer. Easily do that if we're having trouble selecting it within our scene. We can easily do that in the outliner. We're going to Windows, Outliner. We have a list of all the objects in our scene, including the squash handle. Because it's parented to the sphere, you'll have to click this little expansion plus mark icon here to show the squash handle in the list, and you can select it individually. So with the squash handle selected, we want to keyframe the points that are affecting the ball, which would be the points where the ball is hitting the floor. So we can select the ball and see here in the graph editor these points that the ball hits the ground. So we can go to frame 15, for example, and we can zoom in on the ball. We can adjust these, hopefully get some room here so we can see. So at frame 15, we know for a fact that the ball is striking the ground, and at that point we want the squash to be taking effect. So I'll select my squash handle, go here in the channel box, and I can adjust my factor. So I'm going to squash it down, not too much, we don't want to do anything too crazy, but just enough so we have some kind of impact effect like this. So it looks like I'm doing about negative 0.25. So I'm going to right click on the factor and say key selected. It's going off the screen here, but there is the key selected option just like there is on the other channels in the scene. Key selected. So I've set a keyframe for the factor channel of the squash deformer at frame 15 with a factor of negative 0.25. Now I haven't made any other keyframes, so at the beginning of the scene, if I go back to frame 1, press F, you'll notice that the ball is still squashed, and that's okay. I'm setting the keyframes for all of the points where the ball hits the ground first, and then I'll go back and make the ball be unsquashed when it's not supposed to be. So another thing we can do is we can adjust the max expand position, which by default is at 0.5. And what that simply means is the position of the maximum amount the ball is expanding, which would be in this right through here, is right now positioned in the middle of the ball. We can lower this down so that the max position is toward the base of the ball, like this. And then if we adjust our factor some more, you can see how it kind of gets wider toward the bottom of the ball. You'll see as I adjust this max expand position slider, what happens as that line moves up and down. So we want it to kind of favor the floor, like so. There's also the expand value. So even though our factor is not changing, the expand value kind of changes the amount that factor is multiplied. Adjusted my expand value and my max expand position value. I'm going to go ahead and keyframe those as well at frame 15. So right click on those, say key selected. So now I want to go to the next bounce position, which is going to be at frame 39. And then I'll press F to frame my view again so I can find it, select my squash deformer, and then I'll keyframe those values again at frame 39. So I'll just select those channels, right click and say key selected. So now you'll see here in the graph editor we have a straight line for those keyed channels because nothing's changed yet. I'm just setting those markers for when the ball is hitting the ground. Go to frame 56 for the next strike. Now at this point, the ball is going to be losing some speed. It hit and then hit, and now it's kind of hitting a little bit and losing the impact of the original hits from the bouncing of the ball. So we can start lowering that factor so it's not going to be quite as squashed down when it hits the ground as much as it was at the beginning of the throw. So at this point, at frame 56, I'll select the squash in the channel box. I'm going to increase that factor some so it's not quite as much of an impact, so about -0.2 instead of -0.25. I'll grab all these values again and key selected. Let's go to the next impact, and this is when it's starting to really lose its impact effect. I'm going to probably increase this factor. I don't want to go higher than 0 because 0 is the completely spherical look for the ball. Let's say -0.1 or so. Just type that in, hit enter. And that's probably going to be barely noticeable, but that's okay. I'll right click and key select it at this point, and then I'll move to the next point, and I'll probably just decrease this factor back to 0, meaning that the squash no longer has any effect at this point in the animation. And I'll key select it. So now I have all of my impact effect. Let's go back to frame 1, and let's take a look at our scene. I'll zoom out so we can see the whole thing. And again, remember, the squash is never going away until the end of the animation. We need to still go through and take away the squash where we don't want it. I'll select the ball. You can see our graph editor curves here. Hit play. Oops, go down the scene. Alright, so now let's take away the squash where we no longer want it. So let's go back to frame 15. So this is when the ball actually hits the ground. Now it's going to squash, but right before it hit the ground, like up here, it won't have any squash at all, right? So going back to the beginning of the animation to set the squash to 0 will only mean that it will slowly become squashed as it falls to the ground and hits this point where the squash is taking effect completely. So what I'm going to do actually is go back a step, just one frame, grab the squash, factor 0. Then I right click on it and key select it. So now as the ball hits, it gets that squashed effect. So before that, now the ball is completely spherical. Let's hit play. So at the very beginning, there we go. So we still need to add in the unsquashing after the initial hit, but you'll see the ball is spherical until it hits the ground where it becomes squashed like that. So now we're getting somewhere. So back at frame 15, as it comes off the ground, the next frame over, it should be losing that squash effect. It'll actually kind of stretch upwards as it kind of rebounds off of the impact from the floor. So let's just go a couple frames, let's say 20, frame 20, grab our factor again, and now let's go into a positive number. We could even just say the reverse of -0.25, let's do positive 0.25. And then that max expand position, we can increase that value so it's back up toward the middle of the ball, 0.5. And the expand factor, we can probably leave that alone. So I'm going to grab the factor and the max expand position keys, channels, right click and key select it, like so. We may need to adjust the timing of how much this stretch happens, but you can see here just scrubbing through, ball hits, squashes, and then as it bounces back up it kind of stretches and it hits again like so. So we still need to make that change as it goes forward, but I think this looks pretty good so far. So at frame 20, the ball has stretched like so. I'm just going to go to frame 22 maybe, change that factor to 0 so the ball's back to normal. Right click on it and key selected. So it stretches and then rebounds back to normal really quickly. This might even be too slow, just these few frames through here. Let's hit play. Like so. And you'll see at frame 22, between frames 22 and 39, the ball slowly kind of squashes again. That's because we need to go to the frame before the ball hits the ground. Here at frame 39, we're at our impact. If we go one frame before that, the ball should not be squashed yet because it hasn't hit the ground. So we'll change the factor to 0 here. Right click on it and key selected. So now between 22 and 38, the factor is 0 throughout the entire remaining arc of this ball's bounce until it gets to the frame where the ball hits the ground and squashes like so. So the ball's perfectly spherical, squash, stretch, back to normal as it arcs through, and then squash again. So just need to kind of repeat these kinds of steps for each bounce, and not forgetting that as the bounce gets past this second one or so, that impact is going to be lessened, and so the amount of squash and stretch is going to be a lot lower. So here we had our second impact on the ground. We can probably lower that factor just slightly, say negative 0.2, enter, and maybe keyframe that so it's not quite as much of a impact as it was the first time. So before, our hit was at 15, and at frame 20, which is 5 frames later, we had the stretch happen. So here we're at frame 39. 5 frames later, it will be 44. Let's go one frame before that, just to kind of, it's very subtle, but just to kind of show the lessening impact effect of the bounce and increase the factor to positive 0.2. So it gives that stretch, and then put the max expand position back to 0.5 and keyframe both of these. Key selected. So here we have our impact and then rebound with a stretch, and then just a couple frames after that we'll take our factor back to 0 as it snaps back into position. And then as it moves through the air, you'll see it slowly squashing again as it goes through the air, because we need to set our keyframe that one frame before impact with another factor of 0. Right click and key selected. So now it rises through the air, it hits with a squash, stretch, kind of rebounds back to 0, back to normal, flies through the air, and then squashes as it hits the ground again. We'll go, say, 2 frames after that. And actually, at this point, because the bounce is so low, so small, we'll actually just say at 1 frame after the initial squash, we'll take our factor back to 0 with no stretch involved this time. Key selected. And then 1 frame before the next impact, take our factor to 0 again. Right click and key selected. And after that point, it's no longer doing any squashing or stretching. So let's zoom out again so we can see our whole scene play out. We can actually press space to fill the scene up a little bit. Rewind, play. So hopefully you can see the impact of the ball there. So it's a subtle effect having the squash and stretch affect the ball, but it definitely adds a little bit of dynamics to how the ball looks. It makes it more realistic as well. Let's go back to our perspective view. Maybe we can see it a little better. You can see the squash deformer still attached to the ball. It's pretty good. And then the last thing we want to do is just add a little bit of a spin to it. Right now our rotation values have remained unkeyframed throughout the whole thing. At the point where it's rolling across the floor, like here, we can start adding a bit of a spin to it. Let's say through here, let's say starting at frame 57 or so, we can select rotate X, right click and key selected, and then at the end of the animation, let's say it spins a few times. I'll try 720 at first, right click and key selected. So it's just kind of spinning like so at the end of the animation. If we go back to our graph editor view with our sphere selected, you see we have a lot more stuff in here just because we have all the squash factor and expand and all that stuff keyframed, all these little lines through here. But also amongst here is rotate X, this red channel which we can isolate by selecting it here and pressing F to see it. So again, you see our default tangency of this curve kind of gives it this kind of flowing effect. And what we can do is adjust it the same way we did with the other curves so that that rotation kind of slows down toward the end of the balls rolling. Just by grabbing these handles and adjusting their positions, you can get a curve like this. So now as we scrub through here, the ball's spinning and rotating as it's coming to a rest. And 720, we can change that value at the end of the animation here by selecting this keyframe. You can either type in a new value or you can just simply move it up and kind of see how that looks. I moved it up slightly so it's not ending with the poles of the sphere pointing exactly up, which gives it a little bit more of a natural feel. With the poles pointing directly up, it makes it look a bit more mechanical. So that's our ball. If you wanted to hide the squash deformer, you can go to the show menu here and uncheck deformers. So it's still there, it's just no longer being visible. We can rewind our scene and press play. And you can go back and tweak as much as you'd like. One thing I might do, for example, is make the stretch not last quite as long because it's kind of noticeable, especially after that first bounce or so. But in any case, I think our bouncing ball tutorial has concluded. We can select our ball and go back to the graph editor to check out all of our animation curves. Again, you can isolate certain ones, press F to frame them in your view. This is our main one we worked with the translate Y to get the actual bouncing motion. Translate Z is the movement across the room, and rotate X at the end of the animation to get that little spin and slowly come to a rest. But in any case, the bouncing ball tutorial has concluded. We're going to continue with our beginner's animation course by taking it up a notch. We're going to be looking at a actual model that will be provided. Nothing too complex or crazy. We're going to be doing a simple jack in the box. We're going to have the box that the jack is within, the crank handle to crank it up, and then the box kind of opens up, the jack pops out and bounces around, and it should be pretty fun. So hope you'll stick around and watch the next part. We'll see you then.